had a little debate with my friend the other night. I was telling her about my reading, and she was like, "Oh, deficits don't matter." And I've heard that before, right? And I hadn't read enough at the time to really be able to respond to it. And I was like, yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that, but I need to look into this more because I think it's possible that ours is getting big enough that it does matter. And so I've been reading William Gale's book called Fiscal Therapy, and he is the tax expert I am going to be interviewing next week. And there was a very interesting little piece in this book that I just read that was talking about how deficits actually might be or have been posited to be a conservative strategy for cutting social spending because it's like that George Lakoff theory. If you don't know George Lakoff, he's a linguist he wrote a book I read called Don't Think of an Elephant about linguistic tricks that kind of get your brain doing one thing. And Republican political operatives have really successfully used these tricks, like, for example, the phrase tax burden, right? They've associated the word burden with the word tax. Even liberals use this phrase, and it drives me bananas because if taxes are a burden, then anybody who cuts them is a hero, even though tax cuts might be going to the wealthy and taking money directly out of the pockets of poor people and children, right? Is that heroic? I don't think so. And yet this little linguistic device positions it in your mind as a positive thing. And so we tend to all just jump on and love tax cuts and think they're all great. And we don't have this like association in the other side of like, well, where are we going to take the money from? Who are we going to, are we taking the money from the poor to give to the rich? Is that really such a good thing? So this is a theory posited by George Lakoff. And this budget deficit idea, there's this theory that William Gale has just touched on. He's not saying it exists. He's very neutral, just presenting people have said this could be a strategy. And it's very interesting. If you were to run up the deficit, it used to be in US history that we only ran big deficits during wartime. And typically in a good economy, once the economy got going again, we would pay back a lot of the wartime debt, and we would be able to borrow again at good rates. There's this whole interesting history. Hamilton was pro the US borrowing, pro debt, pro being able to borrow so we could do big things. Madison was anti. He thought the debt was a scourge, right? I actually think the answer lies somewhere in the middle, and they're both really right? They can both, depending on the situation, they're both right. So the theory goes, if you run up the deficit to such a degree where the interest payments are huge and we have to cut other spending in order to manage either paying back the deficit or simply servicing the debt through interest payments, you don't ever have to have a conversation about cutting public school funding or healthcare. You don't have to even have that conversation. It just becomes necessary, right? So it's pretty interesting then when you pair that with looking at the history of which presidents, which administrations have run up the peacetime debt. We didn't used to do that, and now we have been. So who was the first president to run up the peacetime debt? Ronald Reagan. Who was the next one? George W. Bush. Any guesses who the next one was? It was Trump.